Our first speaker is Stephen Lister, who says, well, I'm a jobbing poultry vet, a bit like, you know, David Chenrals with the pigs, but is in fact a founding diplomat of the European College of Veterinary Poultry Science, and has had many different positions on established bodies such as FAWC and the Animal Welfare Foundation. And so he's going to talk to us today on how the poultry farming industry is using data to improve animal health and welfare. Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. So I get the graveyard slot, and you all got comfortable chairs, but and I've just heard they're going to increase the temperature. So if you all nod off, the lighting's such that I can't see you, so that's all right, really. And also, I warn Laura, I'm a chairman's nightmare because I always overrun, so this should be fun. Yeah, I'm going to talk to you about some poultry matters, and interestingly, if you look at the AWF new logo, I think poultry is often quite hidden, but I'm not sure whether the chicken, ducks and turkeys are hiding behind the cows and the horse, really. So we do have one avian species on the back of the horse, anyway. I'll start with the picture. I don't know how many of you have been in commercial poultry sheds, but a bit like David's happy pig sitting in the proverbial, these are happy turkeys. This sort of picture, to me, is what makes me buzz. I think these are a shed of birds in natural light. Okay, there's a lot of them, but they're all up, they're all snowy white, they're all just about to go to processing, they've all met their target weight, been very low mortality. But the usual perception, obviously, for poultry is that we keep them behind closed doors because we don't want anybody to see them. The truth really is that, you know, poultry industry is very integrated, very vertically integrated, gives great audit trails, all sorts of advantages. A lot of the do not enter type things are to do with biosecurity because we are talking about large numbers. But it does give us the perception that the intensive poultry industry is part of intensive animal production, and you can go back 50 years to Ruth Harrison when she sounded the warning note of where things could go wrong. Just a very quick look through the development of the poultry industry. Obviously, it developed as part of the wartime effort to put food on the table, and the Ministry of Agriculture then promoted the keeping of poultry by domestic poultry keepers, and there were over 1 million poultry by the end of the war, only kept in groups of about 6 birds, but that accounted for 30% of the national poultry flock at that time. If you come up to now, if you look on various websites of various retailers, you can buy all the most glamorous, up-to-date coops to keep birds in your back garden, and it's a big industry, and they're estimated to be at least 3 million backyard poultry being looked after. So that gives people a bit more of an understanding of what poultry are, but again, it really gives me as a poultry veterinarian more of an issue because this is perceived as being great, but anything else larger frightens people often. And this is why it frightens. We're talking about numbers, and when we're going to talk about data collection is that if we have to demonstrate what we're doing, how we're doing it, why we're doing it, we have got to come up with a sort of evidence base, and it is going to be difficult to do this just because of the sheer numbers. People like to eat chicken. Poultry has increased in its consumption and relative to red meat, and it's estimated that poultry globally will become the #1 meat product in about 2030. And its numbers again. This was this was 2009, so I suspect the figures are much bigger. But you know, up to 52 billion chickens eaten, killed for food each year. Some even killed without pre-stunning. The human population is expanding as well, 7 billion now and counting. UN has estimated 9 billion by 2050. I'm not going to get into the ethical debate about how we feed the world, but just the fact that it's a fact of life. and it's estimated we need to have a 100% increase in world food production. Whether that's all animal protein or not, we don't know, but it's got to be a 100% increase. It will almost certainly have to be from the same land area, and this means that if that's going to happen, especially with animal protein, but also with plant protein as well, it will need to be through the use of increasing technology to actually improve the efficiency of production. But we want to do it sustainably. Sustainability is the real buzzword in lots of spheres, and food and farming area is not missed out on that. And that brings us to this so-called oxymoron of sustainable intensification. Many people think this is the only way to go, but can you have intensification and still be sustainable? Some people would say not, but you know it is something that we have to grasp. And Marion Dawkins, in her forward to the reprint of Ruth Harrison's book, had said this, that we need to take that wobbly word sustainable and give it enough backbone to make sure it stands for high standards of animal welfare and safeguard one of its cornerstone priorities. And Farm Animal Welfare Committee has come out with a similar stance that welfare shouldn't be the sort of poor relation in that debate about sustainable intensification. So for me, especially when I was at vet school 35 years ago, very few welfare lectures, but lots of lectures about disease and disease control. And that we were told, and I'm still convinced, that disease is one of the biggest affronts to an animal's welfare. The way you then think about welfare and disease control and your job as a vet as you go through does vary quite a bit and improve, and that rather than just treat disease, and we talk about preventing disease, alleviating suffering we heard about this morning, but promoting positive welfare. And that's again where we're trying to make sure that we're working in that way. But we're not always believed when we go down this route. Philip Limbury's book, published earlier this year, is not particularly complimentary about vets working in the food animal sector, and feels that we are propping up factory farming systems without due regard to welfare. So that's a challenge for us. When you look at consumer research, really there are still a lot of people who are disengaged and are not really interested, if you like, in animal welfare in their purchasing activities. This varies. This was 2011, and these percentages can go up and down. There are quite a number of people who are what they call this mainly hens. So they perceive, they can see that they have choice side by side in the supermarket about what type of eggs they produce and from what production system, and they can make a very quick decision on that with labelling and with at least their perception of what they're buying in the different systems. And then you've got this middle ground of people who are really, sort of showing a trade up on welfare, but there still are other aspects of their buying decisions that come in. And even in the States, which has a history of, oh, well, they don't care about welfare over there, is beginning to trade up on its views, with more of the people placing greater importance on welfare outcomes and on animal production. And they were saying that these they were called basic welfarists who are interested in welfare. But when you drill down and ask them the question, what they were saying was that, well, good basic welfare is really just giving animals food, water, and treatment for disease prevention. So the sort of the basic stuff from the most basic of food, farm assurance schemes. But then when you ask them to rank animal welfare compared to other social issues they come across, don't look quite so concerned, really. The well-being of farm animals comes down well on their list of priorities, and below the welfare of the farmers as well on that piece of work. So we all know that there are barriers to what consumers are going to do about their welfare buying activity. A large one still must be cost, and we've seen that during the current recession that has had a big impact on people's buying activities. But the bottom one is information. There's a lot of people say, well, we just really don't know. We can't go into a supermarket. Labelling, for whatever reason, it might be put on there, doesn't always give them all the information they need. And so again, farm assurance, the use of data, use of welfare outcome data, which I'm going to talk about, does begin to give an option to give more information and, where possible, independent information. And Colin Spedding said some time ago that if only people would vote with their sort of what they say they will do rather than with their purses, then you know, if one of the biggest things that my clients say to me is that they could afford to drop stocking densities, they could afford to do all sorts of things to promote higher welfare if they got an economic return for what they're doing. But it is difficult with that global context we're talking about to compete if there is if A, the consumer's not going to follow that lead, and B, they're not going to be protected from cheaper imports that may come from a welfare standard that's lower. I'm not going to talk about economics other than to say that the poultry industry does work on low margins, and this is from last week's Poultry World, and you don't need to get too hung up on the figures, but the headline was "Supermarkets turn to poultry meat in a war to slash prices," and poultry has been taken as the sort of sacrificial lamb to go in this war that's developing between the discounters and the more established retailers. And you can see that there's massive price differences that are being quoted, which is going to, if anything, drive down prices and returns to farmers if this sort of thing continues. So we have a confused consumer, and you have a fairly glum, equally confused producer as to he wants to produce what the consumer wants, but we've got a consumer that's probably confused as to exactly what it wants. So Farm Assurance, as Farm Animal Welfare Committee looked into 2005, did actually say these comments here that you can read yourself, that they do offer the opportunity to give added confidence and information to consumers, but it's got to be realistic, it's got to be transparent, it's got to be honest, so that people can have confidence in what they're being told. And our own AWF original lecturer, David Main, said last year at BVA that schemes should focus on welfare improvement, not just welfare assurance. And that's the danger. We can't get into, this is not a dig at red tractor, but we can't just stick a label on it and say, right, we've done welfare because we've got this scheme. We've got to have systems that actually work and actually give us some positive feedback, use that data to show that different farmers or different groups are showing improvements. But it is difficult, because who does the assessment? Are we happy that it's the own producers that do the assessment? Are the welfare outcome measures that we're looking at, are they truly assessing the welfare of the birds, or are they proxy look-sees which are helpful, or do they actually, how do we actually use this data? So these are questions that the industry is currently grappling with. We always often come back to the FAWC 5 freedoms as here's our benchmark of where we're looking at. When I was working on Farm Animal Welfare Council, we did have quite a few debates as whether the 5 freedoms need updating, whether they were talking almost too negatively. We're talking about freedom things when we should be talking about good welfare. EU welfare quality has tried to look at that, to actually say, let's look at it from a slightly different angle on good welfare and things to promote it, rather than freedom from nasties. And FAWC, we're already on that, and this whole area of quality of life and a life worth living is trying to distill that into not just satisfying minimum requirements, but actually seeing how far we can go up this gradient to, if not to a good life all the time, at least as a minimum a life worth living for farm animals. But then that begs the question that we discussed earlier this morning about unnecessary suffering and fitness to travel is how do you make that assessment? Is this better than that? That's up to you to think. Is the romantic idea of poultry very extensive systems? Is it inherently better than more intensive systems? Within the laying sector, as I say, where people have made decisions, is free range always going to be better than any house system? And why? What aspects are good? And I really like this sort of McInerney approach to animal welfare. So you've got perceived welfare benefit on this axis and productivity going across to the right. So we have the ability to, by manned intervention, to improve welfare from a sort of natural situation to actually give shelter, to give food, to give water, to give protection from predators. So you can enhance welfare. But it's how far along this line you go. Well, we know society says what's cruel, or legislators say what's cruel. So we've got to work out is where is the compromise between B and D as to where we want to be with animal welfare. So what's good welfare? How do we assess it, and how do you legislate for it? Well, I'd say welfare outcomes is the way that many of us have looked at it, and we've been told to look at as to actually demonstrating that the production system would get away from how many feeders, how many drinkers, to what is the welfare outcome for the different systems we're using for the birds to actually show the welfare benefit or disbenefit. And the industry said, well, we already know that. We don't waste money on producing systems that aren't going to work and the birds are not going to fulfill their potential. So they were looking at, and they still are, at livability, growth rates and efficiency of production, but increasingly resistance to disease, resistance to metabolic issues, and really, as I say, livability, reducing the effect of disease. So the industry and others' thesis would be that birds thrive because of this management environmental provisions. The counter-argument is that maybe birds, just because they grow well, they may be doing that despite the environment and management systems in place. Then we come to, do we use soft or hard data? Hard data, by that I mean good data with good denominators, lots of numbers that actually people can look at statistically. Or do we talk about some of the aspects we were talking about for, or my picture of turkeys at the beginning, which I think demonstrate good welfare, but it's very difficult for me to actually give you numbers on that to say, well, that farm is better than this farm. I've already said who does the assessment, what are the welfare outcomes actually assessing. Welfare outcomes do always have to be, by definition, retrospective, so there's an issue there. And how do we answer David's point about not just monitoring and have a tick box to say we've looked at it? How do we use that to improve welfare? And I'm going to look at two examples on the poultry sector to go through that. One in layers and one in broilers. And we'll start with the shore well, which is answer some of my questions about retrospective, because it's some real-time look-see at what's happening on farms, and also gives the opportunity for interventions during an actual flock's life. It's come through this collaboration between Bristol and Freedom Foods and the Soil Association. It's an ongoing project, and starting off with the laying hens. And what they want to do is to actually assess the flock that's on the ground for things like feather cover. So we're starting to look at welfare outcomes. Feather cover, to me, is an incredibly important thing as a vet. A flock that has good feather demonstrates that he's without vices, but also feather cover, when we're talking about the majority of now of production on free range, is that birds that don't have good feather cover, it's the same with game birds, comes into the debate on beak trimming, which I'll touch on, is that if you don't have good feather cover, these birds will not thrive in their environment. So feather cover is, not only is it something that you can monitor, but it's also something that actually can, in my mind, demonstrate a welfare improvement for birds. Mortality, flightiness, activity is also covered. So yes, you have to start recording, but what Bristol has done is to actually pick something that farmers can do, and farmers can do regularly. You assess 50 birds, and you actually look at them as to where the feather loss is and how severe the feather loss is, what mortality is, and you can start coming up with scores for a flock. So you've got real-time information for a flock through its life. And that, as I say, because feather pecking is an indication that things are not going right, and also they will lead to birds without feathers, or even lead to more aggressive cannibalism and mortality. Feather pecking is something that we need to try and understand to actually improve the welfare of laying hens. So looking at feather cover is a way of the proxy assessment there. We could go down the WI route of actually just knitting little jerseys for birds, but the Assure Well, Feather Well approach, to my mind, is a really good initiative, because, as I say, you're assessing the flock now by counting your 50 birds and actually scoring them. You're assessing that flock over time. You can do it multiply. You can compare it with previous flocks, and also what can happen is you can benchmark it with other flocks nationally. So you're actually beginning then to use data, which, as I say, some people may call soft data, but it has the ability to do benchmarking and see the value of different interventions, which may have been difficult in the past to actually promote to producers, either because it costs money or it costs time input for the stockman to actually put in different interventions to actually distract birds from pecking, or to try and a really useful one is that on free range, birds move from rearing farm to the laying farm, and what is shown to be very, very good for maintaining good feather cover and reduce feather pecking is to give those birds access to the range as soon as you possibly can when the birds arrive. But it's quite a dogma within the industry that if I do that, they won't know where the nests are, we'll have lots of floor eggs, production will go down, we'll have lots of dirty eggs, the consumer will complain. And so it's become a bit fixated. But if you have a system like this, say it's not going to work on every farm. What the Bristol workers have done is find a whole number of different interventions that all en masse improve the situation, but for different farms they're going to have different values. And doing this sort of assessment and data collection will actually be able to demonstrate to different producers what works for them and what doesn't. So it has this ability to improve welfare and improve productivity for the farm as well. And this sort of good practice approach to feather cover, I think is good for welfare, whether we go through beak trimming or not. And since we're talking about welfare outcomes, I will just come on to the aspect of beak trimming, because it could be argued that beak trimming is a positive welfare outcome, because if you look at the top left is an untrimmed and bottom right is a trimmed flock, trimmed bird. Yes, it is a mutilation, and we can discuss that, and I'm getting a red light already, which is frightening me, so we will have to move on quickly. But is this welfare outcome better than this welfare outcome? The second aspect is on the EU Broiler Directive and on broilers. The directive came in first time we had specific legislation for broilers, but it was looking for uniform implementation across Europe, again based on welfare outcomes. The real sort of problem is how do we do assessments at processing that reflect the welfare of birds on the farm? It was sort of called jokingly the Poultry Directive because it was going to look at feet and the quality of feet as the first aspect. Because pododermatitis, although not the biggest welfare problem for birds, was a useful way of assessing stockmanship, litter management, drinker management, that sort of thing. And the FSA has scorecards, and so it is something you can score, but it's a high resource problem to actually do all this recording if it's not been done already. So what they were looking at more was to actually do post-mortem inspection assessments at processing, look at the food chain information data, look at mortality data, reject data to make the overall assessment. It's been in place for some time, started in 2010. FEO audit last year found that the UK had put in a pretty robust method of doing this testing. It's looking at post-mortem conditions that have certain trigger levels on them, which would alert AHVLA to a possible on-farm welfare problem. And these are the sorts of things: ascites as a production issue, cellulitis, skin lesions, dead on arrivals, poor birds, this sort of thing. Sets a trigger level, which is going to alert the problem. And this assessment is lots of number crunching, lot of use of IT, and it comes up with a report like this. And here are the triggers for different conditions. Again, benchmark is important. Here's the national figures for the last 3 months. So one of these goes to every farmer for every house. It will be now looking at performance of this flock and be able to see whether it's exceeded a trigger, which will set a trigger report with AHVLA, but also show them where they are with a national situation. It also now will go live this month with actual historical information for that particular farm. So again, they've got this real-time information. In 2012, that assessment was done for nearly 800 million broilers. Only 2% of the batches coming in exceeded the trigger levels for things like dead on arrivals, ascites, cellulitis. Action plans on those 2% were considered. 87% required no further action, and 13% needed an action plan to be produced with a vet to actually show improvement. So you've got something that has the ability to progress itself and make progress. If I just 2 minutes right at the very end, I came into this thing about enhancing technologies and efficiency of technologies coming in. And this is probably the next phase we're going to go into. It frightens some people is actually using cameras and using lots of information and IT to actually look at what's going on. But I would acknowledge the work of David Speller, who's a very forward-thinking broiler producer, and there are a lot of them now coming through, showing that actually bringing in technology, which will, as it says on the third bullet point, will frighten some consumers. Oh, this is all getting a bit technological. This is not stockmanship. But he would say it is, because he's actually getting real-time information about how his birds are performing, about their activity. What this is showing is he's got you weigh the birds regularly. You can see where the production is going on the weight gains on different days, and you can start looking at, was this a health issue going on? Is it stocking density? Is it food space provision? Something like that. Looking at environmental effects, and he can get it all pushed through to his phone. So he's got this information in front of him all the time. And this sort of the aspect. This guy has a blog, and he has this camera going all the time. So anybody who wants to go and see what happens in his poultry sheds, he said, I can't introduce you onto my farm, but you can have a look and see what's going on my farm all the time. This sort of technology is actually showing that we have cameras that can pixelate the activity of the birds, and you can then start looking at activity. I'm now getting a flashing, so I'm going to get pushed off here in a moment. But the last slide is that it seems all a bit technological, but what you can do, you can produce this sort of dashboard, and you can argue about whether it is really assessing welfare. But on here is looking at feed provision, water provision, this activity, the thermal comfort, and you can actually start giving flocks a welfare score and actually showing whether that improves production. But it's actually just showing to people hard data. So we start opening those doors. Open Farm Sunday's good, but real-time stuff going on to explode some of the myths. And I apologise that was very rushed, but thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Have we got any questions?
I'm Stella Chapman. I'm from the University of Surrey, the new vet school. One of the questions I have is that we're actually introducing welfare into one of the very first modules that the students will be taught, and they have to actually do a welfare audit. Now, we can gain access to virtually every other environment except for poultry. So my question is, it's all very good having, and it's great to see the research that you've got, but if we're trying to train vets of the future and also trying to get them engaged in particularly the pig and the poultry industry because of public health and other concerns, how do we gain access?
I mean, we will take vet students in our practice to see poultry practice, and our clients are receptive to them going on farms. But they would always argue about the biosecurity angle, and that's certainly part of it. But that can be overcome. But I'd have to be really honest. There is a real distrust of people coming in who are making mischief, and there have been so many undercover things going on that produces some scepticism. Now, what my advice to yourselves is what we've done is we've actually, any time we get an approach, we will always go back to the vet school and actually get them to confirm the provenance of whoever it is who wants to go on. And whether they come and see practice of us or we can put them in contact with poultry farmers, is that we do have poultry farmers receptive. But whether that's enough to take the capacity, I appreciate it's a problem.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yes, David.
I thank you for a very informative talk. You posed the question, is all the work at the Broiler Directive, is it actually making a difference? Would you like to give us your view, as it's a few years since the Broiler Directive? Sorry, I should have said I'm David Pritchard, now independent. Thank you.
Thank you, David. I think it is making a difference. I mean, I think it's worked in several ways. It's certainly frightened some producers, because they don't like audits anyway, and if it's an audit that's going to possibly trigger a visit from an animal health vet, they like that even less, I think, really. So it was a bit of a carrot to some of our producer clients who weren't really listening to actually improve things. Nobody likes to fail an audit. Nobody likes a non-compliant. So it has helped in that way, that it's actually had a positive impact on some of the people who were not giving enough attention to what they were doing. But I think the other advantage, you actually showed that things were nowhere near as bad as people painted them to be, because yes, it's not the most robust system. We are using proxy assessments of welfare in the way we've had to do it. But I think that it actually has demonstrated that things are perhaps not as bad out there as people thought they were. And as I say, now the data is quite difficult, and there's just been this refinement now, because it was this every batch of birds that went in, rather than actually sort of accumulating that into a house result, was actually quite difficult for producers to get their head around. Now they've got a distinct house result. It's actually quite useful for them to benchmark and see, again, a bit like the Ashore well and Feather well, they can actually use, there I changed all my drinker system from bell drinkers to closed water system, where I started to use an acid treatment system for my water, and I can show demonstrate an improvement. And that's why this guy, David Speller, he says he can actually start latching lots of things he's done and put money on it, because he's using this technology to show some of the things it improves. So I think yes, it has little improvement. But I'd be interested to know what AHVLA feel as to whether they feel it's had the same benefit, really.
Roger from the Sheep Veterinary Society. Stephen, you showed a picture of the turkeys at the beginning and said these turkeys had good welfare. How would you put that in terms of a life worth living, or was it a good life? And how would you differentiate that?
Well, that was what I was trying to demonstrate. It's very difficult. It's just my opinion. Those birds were protected from the environment. They were growing to their genetic potential, which has showed that they actually are capable of thriving in that environment. They're on good quality food without deficiencies. But yes, and their natural light, natural behaviour. It's always difficult to photograph turkeys because, unlike broilers that do tend to sit down a lot more, broilers stay up, and turkeys stay up, and every time you go towards them, you get this. They come towards you, so they always look higher density than they actually are. But I really don't know how to answer the question, Paul. It is something that if you go around enough birds, I think it was David was talking about. He can go in and look at these pigs, and there's not masses of alarm calls going on all the time, sort of thing, really, and absence of vices, those sort of things that come up with that. But it's like we were talking about unnecessary suffering. It's actually very difficult.
Tony Andrews from Welling. Stephen, how do you prioritise out of the criteria as to which are the most important for the animals? Prioritise out of the criteria you have, which are the most important for the animals?
You're talking specifically about the broiler?
In any of these, as you were doing on that list you had, whether they were good or bad. Right. Now, what are the most important to the animals?
I think it is to they want good food, they want ample water supply, they want a comfortable environment, so that would be good litter conditions underfoot and good air quality, and those are the sorts of things. As one of my larger clients said, that turkeys don't want to be entertained, they don't want to go to the cinema, they just want to have a comfortable environment and a good supply of nutritious food and water.
James Russell, BVA Council, but also a practitioner in Derbyshire. I'm afraid that, like most practitioners, I'm speaking here from experience rather than any better science. And certainly I'm not a chicken vet, but I have a client who produces many, many thousands of birds for Tesco's, and the only involvement with those I have is driving round the sheds to get to his goats further on the farm. But what strikes me from him is his absolute commitment to understanding the link between the economics and the productivity of those chicken houses and the welfare of the birds in it. And that actually translates very well into his goat production. They're incredibly high welfare goats and incredibly high productivity as well. Indeed, he's becoming internationally renowned for the goats he produces. But that takes me on to thinking, why is it that the red meat sector is so far behind in recognising that link between productivity and welfare? And I wonder whether you'd agree with that assertion, and if so, have any suggestions on what we may do to try and promote it further?
I think it's probably gone along the lines that the poultry industry has responded because they've had ample criticism. There does seem to be certainly for cattle and sheep is that the perception is they're outside, they have the freedom, and so therefore the people are not so concerned about them. So the poultry industry has almost been forced to go down